She never imagined her life could collapse in a single week. Divorce papers on the table, her bank account nearly empty, and hope slipping through her fingers like dust. But nothing prepared Elena for the letter that arrived next. A letter from a grandmother she barely remembered. Inside it was a key, a map, and a warning written in trembling ink. Do not trust anyone once you enter the cottage. She thought it was a mistake, until the next morning, when she discovered someone had already broken into her apartment, searching for the same key now trembling in her hand. After the fear from the break-in finally settled into silence, Elena Brooks sat alone in the dim glow of her apartment, clutching the mysterious key as if it were the only solid thing left in her unraveling world. Night pressed against the windows, city lights blurring through the glass like smeared memories she no longer recognized. Everything she knew, her marriage, her home, her sense of direction, had collapsed within days, leaving her stranded in a life that felt too hollow to belong to her anymore. She hadn't slept properly in weeks, not since signing the divorce papers that ended 12 years of trying to be enough for a man who always wanted more. The echo of the judge's gavel still rang inside her, sharp and final, cutting through the last threads of a life she fought too hard to save. Her ex-husband had walked out of the courtroom with a clean suit and a cleaner conscience, while she was left with a cheap apartment, a shrinking bank balance, and a heart that felt permanently bruised. The apartment was barely furnished, nothing more than a sagging couch, a thrift store lamp, and cardboard boxes she hadn't bothered opening. She didn't have the energy to start a new chapter. She barely had the strength to end the last one. Bills were scattered across the table like reminders of how quickly reality could tighten around a person. Final notices, payment demands. Each envelope felt like a hand closing around her throat. But the letter, the thick, cedar-scented letter with her grandmother's name, was different. It didn't belong in this room, in this life, in her current state of collapse. It felt like it had come from another world entirely, one that still remembered her, one that hadn't given up on her yet. She kept reading it over and over, not because she didn't understand it, but because she couldn't believe it. You are the sole heir, Evergreen Valley, a cottage left in your name. She barely knew her grandmother. Margaret Hale had always been an enigma seen in faded family photos, but spoken of rarely, and only in tones that carried more caution than affection. Elena remembered brief childhood visits filled with awkward silence and the distant sound of wind rushing through pines. Her grandmother had lived alone, far from civilization, hidden away in a forest that felt older than anything around it. And now, inexplicably, she had willed her entire property to Elena. Why? Why not Elena's mother? Why not anyone closer, anyone who actually knew the woman? Questions pressed through Elena's mind, each one heavier than the last. But it was the key, cold iron, carved with symbols she didn't recognize, that made her chest tighten with something unfamiliar. Not fear, not hope, something in between, something like a calling she didn't ask for but couldn't ignore. She turned it between her fingers again, watching the lamplight catch on its rough edges. It looked ancient, forged in a time when locks meant secrets, not security. The weight of it felt intentional, deliberate. It wasn't just a key. It was an invitation into something her grandmother clearly never wanted the world to touch until now, or something she wanted Elena to find. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Her phone buzzed. Another email reminder from her landlord, rent due tomorrow. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion drip through her bones. She had been surviving on fumes, hope, and denial. Mostly denial. She wasn't sure how to keep going. And then, as if fate had been waiting for her lowest moment, the letter appeared. Maybe it wasn't fate. Maybe it was something darker, something older. Something that had been circling her family for longer than she understood. She exhaled slowly and pushed up from the couch. The room swayed, not from dizziness, but from the emotional whiplash of losing everything and suddenly inheriting something she didn't understand. She walked toward the window, staring down at the parking lot below. Her breath fogged the glass. A single thought echoed inside her. Why did someone break in? The intruder hadn't taken anything valuable. Not her laptop, not her wallet, not the little jewelry she owned. They had only ransacked the table where the letter had been. They wanted the key. Her pulse quickened as she stepped back, clutching the iron piece tight in her palm. Someone else knew about it. Someone else wanted it badly enough to break into her apartment in the middle of the night. But why? What was in Evergreen Valley that could make a stranger act with such urgency? She lowered herself into the worn-out armchair and stared at the letter again. Each word carried a strange weight, like her grandmother had written them with trembling hands, knowing exactly what danger she left behind. A faint imprint of old perfume clung to the edges. The paper felt older than it looked, like it carried stories long buried beneath dust and secrecy. Her chest tightened. A piece of her, small and fragile, wondered if this was the first moment of something new, something that didn't revolve around loss, disappointment, or starting over from scratch. Maybe her grandmother left her more than property. Maybe she left her answers, meaning, a chance to rebuild, or a mystery she wasn't meant to unravel. The city hummed outside, unaware of the storm stirring invisibly around her. She felt suspended between two lives, one that had already fallen apart, and one waiting for her in the depths of a forest she barely remembered. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She had nowhere left to go, nothing left to lose. If danger was following her, it would follow her whether she stayed or left. But if answers waited for her in Evergreen Valley, she wouldn't find them here. The heaviness in her chest shifted, replaced by something steadier, determination, thin but real. She grabbed her suitcase from where it sat unopened near the front door. Dust puffed into the air as she unzipped it. She packed only what mattered, a few clothes, toiletries, her grandmother's letter, and the iron key she refused to let out of her sight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed the suitcase. She glanced around the apartment one last time, this temporary shelter built from the ruins of her old life. There was nothing here she wanted to cling to. No joy, no future, just memories she was ready to leave behind. As she stepped toward the door, she felt everything shift inside her. The weight of grief, the sting of betrayal, the exhaustion of being broken down. But beneath it all, a single thread of something new began to pull her forward. Not hope, not yet. Curiosity. A quiet, dangerous curiosity that whispered her grandmother's final message wasn't just an inheritance, but a summons. She tightened her grip on the key. The night outside felt colder than usual. The air held a strange stillness, as if the world sensed she was crossing the threshold into something that couldn't be undone. She locked the apartment door behind her without looking back. In the hallway, the old fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied. Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked toward the elevator, the key warming in her palm. Whatever waited for her in Evergreen Valley had pulled her out of the wreckage of her life, and now, with the key in hand and danger trailing just behind her, she felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a beginning. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing her away from the life she once knew, Elena exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her story was no longer ending. It was finally beginning. Morning arrived not softly, but as a pale gray wash that seeped through the blinds and settled over Elena like a quiet reminder that she was still standing at the edge of a life she didn't fully understand. She had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of the key pressing against her, its cold metal imprinting itself into her thoughts. She kept it under her pillow, not because she feared losing it, but because she feared someone might try to take it again. The break-in wasn't a nightmare. The overturned lamp, the scattered mail, the cracked frame of the door, they were all real. Someone had been inside while she slept. Someone had stood only feet away from her in the night, searching, rifling through her life with urgent, frantic hands. Not for valuables, not for money, but for the key she now held like a lifeline. She rose slowly, feeling every ounce of exhaustion in her bones. The air was cold enough to sting. She walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle with trembling hands, and let the quiet hum of heating water steady her breath. Outside, distant sirens echoed through the stillness, blending with the groan of early buses and the clatter of trash cans being dragged to the curb. Ordinary sounds, familiar ones, yet none of it felt ordinary now. She sipped her tea mechanically as she stared at the letter one more time, spread open on the counter. Its words looked almost unreal in the daylight. You are the sole heir to the estate of Margaret Hale. Her grandmother's neatly written name pulled her back into faint childhood memories. Soft, fading fragments she couldn't fully trust. A distant woman with eyes that always seemed to watch the forest rather than her visitors. A woman who never came to birthdays, never sent Christmas cards, never offered explanations for her seclusion in the deep woods of Evergreen Valley, and yet she left everything to Elena, not to her daughter, not to anyone close, but to the granddaughter she barely knew. There had to be a reason. Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it in her bag. She couldn't afford hesitation anymore. The longer she stayed here, the more exposed she was. Whoever had broken into her apartment already knew she had the letter. They probably knew she had the key. They might even know where she lived, which meant they could return. She took a slow breath and tightened her grip on her coat. Every step she took toward the door felt surreal, as though she was watching herself from somewhere outside her body. She wasn't just leaving her apartment. She was stepping out of the wreckage of her old life entirely. Her phone buzzed again, another overdue notice, another weight she could no longer carry. She silenced it and slid the device deep into her pocket. Down in the parking lot, the morning air hit her with a crisp chill as she lifted her suitcase into the trunk. The city was waking up around her, cars rolling out, neighbors shuffling to work, a dog barking somewhere nearby, but none of it touched her. She was moving on instinct now, driven by something deeper than logic. Something like a pull, a whisper, a thread leading her toward the unknown. The engine murmured to life beneath her hands. She glanced at the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the intruder watching from somewhere. But there was nothing, just the thin outline of buildings rising behind her like shadows of a life she was finally ready to leave behind. The streets blurred into one another as she drove, gray, familiar, unremarkable. The city looked like it did every morning, but for the first time Elena didn't feel trapped inside its walls. She was leaving, truly leaving. Each mile put distance between her and everything that had broken her. Her failed marriage, her empty apartment, her dwindling savings, and the fear that had wrapped itself around her like barbed wire. Hours passed. The sky shifted from gray to muted blue. Traffic thinned. Buildings gave way to stretches of open road. Fields stretched out on either side, dotted with patches of frost and the remnants of last night's fog. The world felt wider here, quieter. But even as the scenery softened around her, Elena felt a growing tension inside her chest, a quiet unease she couldn't shake. She didn't know what waited for her in Evergreen Valley. She didn't know why her grandmother had isolated herself there, or why she guarded the cottage so fiercely that even distant relatives were unwelcome. All she knew was that the key had value. Not because of what it unlocked, but because someone else wanted it badly enough to break into a stranger's home in the dark. She kept glancing at her purse on the passenger seat, where the key rested beneath layers of fabric. A single object, a single mystery, yet it now felt like the center of a storm she hadn't realized she was standing in. The road guided her toward the mountains slowly, the forest growing thicker around her with each passing mile. Pines rose tall and dense, lining the landscape like towering guardians. Their branches swayed with the wind, whispering over the hood of her car, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant secrets. She turned down the narrow road outlined in the letter. The pavement gave way to gravel. Gravel faded into packed dirt. Every bump, every turn, every tree leaning in closer, made her more aware of the isolation pressing in. The loneliness wasn't frightening, it was strangely familiar. Her grandmother had lived here for decades, alone, unseen, untouched by the world that kept moving beyond the tree line. Elena couldn't understand how someone could choose this solitude. Unless they were hiding something, protecting something, holding on to something they couldn't allow anyone else to touch. The forest path twisted again, revealing a glimpse of mist curling through ancient pine trunks. Birds scattered from the roadside as she passed, their wings flashing against the light. The deeper she drove, the more she felt the weight of her grandmother's silence pressing in from all sides. It didn't feel like a simple inheritance. It felt like stepping into a world that had been waiting for her. The road dipped into a hollow where sunlight barely touched the ground. The trees here were older, thick, towering giants draped in moss. The air felt colder, the shadows darker. The forest seemed to inhale slowly, as though acknowledging her presence. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Finally, through the dense columns of pines, she saw it. A sign, weathered, faded by time, Evergreen Valley 2 miles. The letters looked hand-carved, nearly erased by years of harsh winters and wind. But the name was unmistakable. This was the place her grandmother had guarded so fiercely, the place her family avoided, the place no one ever spoke of without lowering their voice. Elena felt her heartbeat shift again, faster now, stronger, as though something inside her recognized the path ahead, even if her mind didn't. As she drove the remaining miles, the valley opened before her, revealed like a secret pulled from the earth. A quiet, untouched world of towering forest, shimmering streams, and light drifting down through the leaves like falling dust. It was hauntingly beautiful, but there was an unspoken heaviness to it, an ancient stillness that carried the weight of stories buried beneath the roots. She slowed the car near the valley entrance, letting the moment settle. It felt like crossing an invisible line, one that separated the life she knew from the life she was being drawn into. The cottage wasn't visible yet, but the forest felt alive around her, watching, listening, remembering the woman who once walked these paths alone. Elena stepped out of the car, the air wrapped around her like a cold breath. Pine needles crunched beneath her feet. Somewhere in the distance, water trickled softly through rocks. She glanced down the path stretching ahead, winding deeper into the woods. This was it, her grandmother's world, her inheritance, her mystery. As she lifted her suitcase from the trunk and started walking toward the hidden home of a woman whose secrets had outlived her, Elena sensed something subtle in the wind, something like a warning or a whisper or a memory not meant for her. The forest watched, the valley waited, and Elena stepped forward, unaware of how deeply this place would reshape everything she ever thought she knew. As the pines closed around her and the last traces of the modern world fell away, she felt it again, that faint electric pull of something beginning, a story unfolding beneath her feet. And though she didn't yet understand the danger that followed her or the legacy hidden beneath the cottage floor, One truth settled quietly in her heart as she walked deeper into the valley. The letter hadn't changed everything. This place would, and the night ahead whispered that her grandmother's secrets were only just beginning to surface. After the long road behind her finally disappeared into the forest shadow, Elena Brooks followed the narrow dirt path deeper into Evergreen Valley, her footsteps soft against the moss-covered ground. The air here felt different, thicker, colder, almost watchful. Light filtered through the pines in thin, trembling ribbons, giving the world a silver, blue glow. Even the wind moved cautiously, as though afraid to disturb whatever secrets the valley held. Her grandmother's cottage was somewhere ahead. Every step felt like moving toward a memory she never truly had. The forest stretched endlessly around her, towering trunks rising like cathedral pillars, their bark etched with time and silence. Elena tightened her grip on her suitcase handle, her breath visible in small clouds. She had been cold before, emotionally, endlessly, but this was different. This cold carried a presence, a weight, a quiet pulse beneath the trees. She passed a cluster of stones wallowed by moss, their shapes too deliberate to be accidental. Old markers, perhaps, or boundaries, the kind of silent warnings that only made sense to those who lived here long enough to understand them. Her grandmother understood them. Elena did not yet. The path curved slowly, hugging the side of a small hill draped in ferns. The sound of running water reached her first, a slow, steady stream cutting through the valley like a silver thread. She followed it with her eyes and saw the old footbridge ahead, bowed under the weight of years. Wooden planks creaked as she stepped across it, each sound echoing just a little too loud in the silence. And then, through the veil of pines, she finally saw it, the cottage. It sat at the edge of a clearing, small and solitary, wrapped in a blanket of old ivy and soft green moss. Time clung to its walls like a second skin. The roof, covered in rusted tin, glimmered faintly beneath the drifting sunlight. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, yet the stones around it remained soot-kissed, fresh enough to make Elena wonder just how recently her grandmother had tended them. A strange stillness settled around the clearing, not lifeless, just extremely still, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Elena stepped forward slowly. The cottage felt untouched, preserved exactly as her grandmother must have lived in it. A woven mat lay at the door, frayed at the edges but clean. A rusted lantern hung from a hook above the frame. A wind chime crafted from small carved bones and wood swayed softly, though the air was hardly moving. The sound was faint, delicate, eerie. It didn't sound like a welcome. She exhaled and stepped closer, noticing scratches along the bottom of the wooden door. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate. Thin marks cutting into the grain in the same direction, the same pattern. Not from animals, not from years of use. Something, or someone, had dragged metal or stone across the wood intentionally. Her pulse quickened. She knelt down, running her fingers over the marks, feeling their sharpness. The edges were fresh, too fresh. Someone had been here recently. Her hand drifted instinctively to her bag, where the iron key lay hidden like a heartbeat. She rose slowly and tried the doorknob. It turned with a soft metallic click, as though it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was cold but strangely clean, not abandoned, musty, not forgotten, stale, clean, as if someone had tended the place not long ago, as if someone still did. Light seeped through the windows in muted streaks, illuminating dust particles floating like tiny ghosts. The cottage interior felt frozen in time. Every object was placed with meticulous care. A patchwork quilt on the couch, books stacked neatly by the fireplace, framed paintings of quiet forests and rivers lining the walls. The air carried a faint scent of dried herbs and old pine wood. Elena took slow steps forward, letting her gaze travel over the space that had belonged to a woman she hardly knew. A ceramic mug sat on the small dining table, empty but spotless. A pair of knitted gloves lay folded beside a basket of dried lavender. No dust coated them. Someone had touched them recently. Her grandmother lived here, breathed here, moved through these rooms long after the world forgot she existed. Elena's throat tightened with an emotion she wasn't prepared for, something like homesickness for a place she had never been. She walked deeper inside, her footsteps almost silent against the wooden floor. But then she stopped. Something felt off. A coldness lingered in the air near the fireplace, sharp, unnatural, like a pocket of winter trapped in the room. She moved closer, placing her hand near the hearth where the sensation was strongest. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. Her breath hitched. She pulled her hand back instantly. The chill wasn't coming from the stone or the chimney. It radiated from the floor beneath her feet. A chill that felt deliberate. She crouched slightly, trailing her fingers along the base of the fireplace. The cold pulsed outward like a heartbeat, slow, steady, unnatural. Something beneath the floor was colder than the air around it. Her knees grazed the wooden boards as she leaned closer, and the floor responded with a faint, hollow vibration, a subtle echo that didn't match the rest of the cottage's solid foundation. Hollow, something beneath. Her grandmother's diary pages, missing now, had spoken of a burden beneath her feet. Elena swallowed and stood. She moved away from the fireplace instinctively, feeling a prickle run up her spine. She wandered into the bedroom next. The room was small, with a single bed neatly made, its quilt pulled tight as if expecting a guest. A dresser sat in the corner, its drawers closed but polished. A window overlooked the dark forest beyond, where sunlight struggled to reach the ground. On the nightstand, a candle burned down to its last inch, wick darkened. It hadn't been lit long ago, but what caught her attention was the diary, leather, bound, worn at the edges, sitting at the foot of the bed, as if placed there intentionally. Her grandmother's handwriting sprawled across the pages, but many were missing, torn out carefully, leaving behind jagged edges. Whatever secrets they held were no longer here. Still, the remaining entries whispered fragments. They keep searching. Footsteps outside at night. I must not falter. The burden beneath the floor must remain untouched. Elena's pulse thundered. Visitors, searching, a burden beneath the floor. She closed the diary gently and set it aside, her fingers trembling. The cottage was no longer just a home. It was a vault, a guardian, a warning. She stepped back into the main room, letting her eyes move across the space again, slower this time. The scratches on the door, the cold spot, the hollow floor, the missing diary pages. Her grandmother hadn't lived in cozy isolation. She lived in fear. Elena felt the forest closing in outside, its silence deepening like a held breath. She walked toward the window, brushing aside a curtain to peer out. The pines swayed slightly. Their branches whispered against one another with a sound like faint voices. Shadows moved between the trunks, soft, shifting shapes she couldn't quite distinguish. A prickle crawled across the back of her neck. Someone could easily stand out there, hidden by the trees, watching the cottage, watching her, just like someone had been watching her back in the city. She let the curtain fall, blocking the view. The cottage wasn't abandoned. It was waiting for her, for the key, for whatever truth her grandmother died protecting. A deep unease tightened in her chest as she moved toward the center of the room. She rested her hand once more on the wooden floorboards near the fireplace, feeling the cold pulse beneath them. This place held secrets older than her fears, older than the danger following her. She wasn't ready to face them. But the cottage didn't care. It simply waited. Elena inhaled shakily, lifting her gaze to the window again. just as a shape moved in the trees, quick, subtle, gone before she could fully register it. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The forest was watching, and she had just stepped into the center of its oldest secret. As the quiet deepened and the air grew colder around her, Elena realized one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever her grandmother protected didn't want to stay hidden anymore. And as evening shadows stretched long across the valley, she sensed the first tremor of something larger awakening beneath the floorboards, something that would pull her deeper into her grandmother's world than she ever intended to go. The pines rustled softly, as if whispering her name. The light outside dimmed slowly, swallowed by the thick canopy of pines, as Elena stepped deeper into the cottage. Shadows lengthened across the wooden floor, stretching like quiet reminders that night settled earlier in Evergreen Valley than anywhere she had lived before. A place untouched by time, but shaped by secrets. A place her grandmother guarded until her final breath. She reached for the switch on the wall, half expecting the bulbs to be dead after years without use. But the lights flickered once, then glowed softly, casting a warm amber hue across the room. The sudden illumination made the silence even heavier, as if the walls had been holding their breath. Her suitcase sat untouched by the door, but Elena didn't move to open it. Instead, she wandered slowly, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The cottage felt familiar despite the years and the distance. Something in the arrangement of objects, the careful placement of books, the perfectly centered rug, the evenly stacked firewood, carried the imprint of a mind that found safety in order. A person who trusted routine more than people. Her grandmother had lived here alone, yet nothing felt abandoned. Not the smooth, spined books waiting on the table, not the clean dishes stacked neatly in the cupboard, not the old kettle resting beside the stove as if ready to boil again, and not the floorboards beneath her feet, which seemed almost alive with a faint murmur of cold. She walked to the window again and pulled aside the curtain. Outside, the clearing was washed in fading daylight, thin streaks of gold stretching over the ferns, the moss, the pathway she had walked. But beyond that, the forest absorbed everything, light, sound, presence. It swallowed the world whole. As she stared, the wind shifted and swept through the branches, creating a low, hollow hum. It rolled through the pines like a warning too soft to interpret, too heavy to ignore. She let the curtain fall. The house creaked once, settling. It wasn't loud, just a small, lonely sound, but it sent a ripple up her spine. She stepped toward the small hallway that connected the bedroom to the rest of the cabin. A faint scent drifted from the walls, lavender, pine resin, and something faintly metallic beneath it. She paused, inhaling deeper, not metallic, cold, the same cold that seeped from the floor. She moved toward the dining table next, tracing her fingers along the carved wooden edge. A thin layer of polish still clung to the surface, reflecting the lamplight. A stack of folded linens sat waiting in a woven basket beside it. Her grandmother was meticulous, almost obsessively so. Every item seemed placed with intention, as though removing or disturbing anything would unravel the delicate fabric of the cottage. Elena moved toward the shelves lining the far wall. Old books, some leather, bound, others in faded cloth, filled the wooden compartments. A few titles caught her eye: nature guides, maps, journals, local folklore, handwritten notes tucked into the spines. One particular book stood out, a thick, hand-stitched volume with her grandmother's initials pressed into the cover. No title, just the initials. She reached for it slowly, as though touching something sacred. Dust drifted in the air as she opened it. The pages were filled with sketches, pines, valleys, symbols carved into tree bark, old paths twisted through the forest. Some pages held pressed flowers, Others held cryptic notes written in a hurried, heavy pen. But on one page, deep near the back, she found a drawing that made her heart stumble. A rough sketch of the cottage floor. Lines marked the boards, circles marked certain spots, and beneath the drawn fireplace, a shaded square was labeled with a single word, hollow. Her breath caught. She traced the shape with her fingertip, then closed the book gently, as if the page might whisper something dangerous if left open too long. Setting it back on the shelf, she exhaled slowly, letting the weight of discovery settle into her chest. She turned toward the floor again. Her grandmother hadn't just noticed something beneath the cottage. She knew exactly where it was. Elena stepped closer to the fireplace, placing her foot lightly against the cold board. The temperature drop hadn't changed. It seeped upward like frost trapped beneath the surface. The wood felt solid, but the sensation beneath it was unmistakable. A hollow space, a breath, a hiding place. Something was down there. Her pulse quickened as she knelt again, pressing her palm against the boards. The cold surged instantly. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from weather. It was the kind that came from metal, stone, or something untouched for decades. She lifted her hand and stood. Whatever secrets her grandmother left behind were buried beneath this house, and someone else knew about them. The scratches at the door, the missing diary pages, the break-in back in the city, the figure moving in the trees, they were all pieces of a single truth. Her grandmother's solitude had not been peaceful. She had been hiding something valuable enough, dangerous enough, that someone had spent years trying to uncover it. And now that burden belonged to Elena. The cottage groaned again under the settling weight of dusk. The air grew colder as night thickened outside. The pine shadows stretched darker across the floor, like long arms reaching inward. She walked slowly toward the small kitchen at the back of the cottage. The sink was polished clean. A single ceramic plate sat on the drying rack, untouched by dust. A jar of herbs hung from a hook overhead, dried rosemary, sage, lavender. Their scent filled the space, warm and calming, but beneath it lingered that same metallic hint she couldn't place. She opened a drawer. Inside lay neatly arranged utensils, nothing unusual. Another drawer held kitchen towels. A third held old recipe cards, each one written in her grandmother's elegant script. But when she opened the cabinet under the sink, her breath stilled. A toolbox sat inside, not the rusty, forgotten kind found in most cottages. This one was clean, newer, organized with precision. Screwdrivers, pliers, a chisel, a small hammer. Her grandmother had tools ready at all times, tools perfect for prying open floorboards. Elena closed the cabinet quietly, tension sliding beneath her skin like a cold ripple. She moved back to the main room. The candle on the table flickered faintly, reacting to a draft she hadn't felt a moment earlier. She looked toward the fireplace again. The cold spot seemed stronger now, pulling her attention like a magnet. The night settled outside in full. The forest darkened, the wind quieted. The world fell into a silence so absolute it felt unnatural, almost staged, like the valley itself was waiting for her next step. She crossed the room slowly, her hand brushing the wall to steady herself. The cottage was small, but in the quiet darkness it felt vast, almost cavernous. Each breath she took echoed faintly, as though the walls absorbed her sound and sent it downward, into the hollow beneath the floor. She kneeled beside the fireplace one more time. Her fingers grazed the cracks between the boards. She half expected to hear a whisper or feel the vibration of something moving below, but the silence remained thick, impenetrable. She looked around the room, searching for anything her grandmother might have left as a clue, a lever, a loose board, an instruction tucked into a note. But everything was carefully arranged, nothing out of place. Except for something she hadn't noticed earlier, the rug. It lay perfectly centered in the room, its edges aligned with precision. Too precise. In a house filled with subtle warnings, a rug placed so purposely could hide something important. Elena walked toward it slowly, her heartbeat quickening. She knelt at the edge and lifted the corner. Dust drifted upward in a soft cloud. The wooden floor beneath was intact, except for one detail, a faint indentation. Barely visible, but unmistakably deliberate, a groove. Her grandmother had hidden something beneath the rug, something close to the hearth, something connected to the cold, something worth protecting for decades. She shifted the rug further, revealing the full outline of the indentation, an old square hatch, sealed so tightly it blended seamlessly with the floorboards. Her breath trembled. This was it, the hollow. The burden beneath the floor, but as she reached for the edges, testing the hatch lightly with her fingertips, something outside shifted, a soft crunch, then another, footsteps, slow, measured, approaching the cottage. Elena froze, the hair on her arms rising. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, knowing exactly where she was. Her grandmother's warning echoed silently from the torn diary pages. They keep searching. Elena's gaze shot to the window. A faint shadow drifted past the tree line. Not an animal, not the sway of branches, a person. The forest exhaled a cold breath through the cracks in the walls. The cottage tightened around her like a held secret. And Elena realized, with chilling clarity, that whatever was buried beneath this floor, she was no longer the only one trying to find it. As the footsteps paused outside, too close, too still, Elena rose slowly, heart pounding, knowing the night in Evergreen Valley had only begun to reveal its darkness. After the footsteps outside finally faded into the forest's silence, Elena remained completely still, her breath caught between fear and disbelief. The night pressed heavily against the cottage walls, thick and motionless, as though the trees themselves had leaned closer to listen. Whoever had been out there wasn't wandering. They weren't lost. They had approached the cottage slowly, deliberately, as if drawn to the same secrets buried beneath the floor. Elena's pulse pounded in her throat as she forced herself to move, her muscles trembling with cold and adrenaline. She stepped away from the hatch she had just uncovered, sliding the edge of the rug back over it with shaky hands. The soft fabric muffled the faint metallic scent rising from the wood, an old smell untouched for decades, now drifting upward like a warning she hadn't asked for. She backed away from the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting for another shadow to appear. But the forest remained eerily still, the pines unmoving, the clearing silent. Whoever had been out there was gone. Or waiting, or watching from a distance she couldn't see. The quiet didn't soothe her. It made everything worse. Elena stepped into the hallway, forcing her breath to steady. She needed answers, real ones. Not scraps, not shivers, not questions her grandmother never lived long enough to explain. She needed something solid to hold on to, something that proved she wasn't imagining the danger closing in. The diary. Her grandmother's diary lay on the bed where she left it. The leather cover looked darker in the low light, worn from decades of use, its pages curved gently from age. Elena picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of the missing pages before she even opened it. There were too many gaps, too many torn edges. Whatever secrets her grandmother wrote down were gone, ripped out with precision, not accidental, not careless, taken. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed, the wooden frame creaking beneath her tired body. She opened the diary again to the page where she left off. The ink was dark, pressed deep into the fibers of the paper, as though her grandmother wrote with urgency. Some lines had small tremors, as if the pen shook in her hand. They came again tonight, voices outside, not asking, searching. I must hide the pages, they cannot find them. Elena, forgive me. Her name, written in her grandmother's handwriting. A tremor ran through her. Her grandmother knew she would read this someday. She kept turning the pages, her eyes scanning each fragment, each scribbled symbol. Some entries weren't written in full sentences. They were rushed notes, half-formed thoughts, coded warnings. Underfloor, but deeper, not for authorities. Blood cost, protect it, even from family. If they come, leave everything behind except. The rest of that sentence was torn away. Her fingers traced the ragged edge, imagining the missing words, the missing warning, the missing truth. If they come, leave everything behind except what? The key, the map, the knowledge of what was hidden beneath the cottage, or something far more dangerous. She turned to another entry. This one was older, ink faded, handwriting steadier. I did not steal them for wealth. I took them because monsters should not inherit power. If the wrong hands find this, the valley will never be safe. I hear the forest learning my footsteps. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the words sink into her bones. Monsters, power, a valley that needed protection. Her grandmother had been guarding something that wasn't simply secret. It was dangerous. The forest outside moaned softly as the wind drifted through the branches, carrying a faint rustle like the echo of distant movement. The sound made her open her eyes again, heart quickening. She turned to the last intact page. The ink was smeared slightly, water, stained, as though her grandmother wrote it in fear or haste. If you're reading this, it means they have learned I am gone. Do not trust the man in the woods. Find the remaining pages before he does. Everything depends on it. Elena's stomach tightened painfully. The man in the woods, the same person who had broken into her apartment, the same shadow she'd seen outside moments ago, the same presence her grandmother feared in her final months. She closed the diary slowly, her fingertips pressing into the cover as if trying to absorb the truth through the leather. Her grandmother didn't suffer from paranoia. She wasn't imagining threats. She spent her life protecting something people would kill for, and now Elena was standing inside the very home built to hide it. She looked around the bedroom, suddenly aware of every creak, every shift in the wind, every shadow that stretched across the floor. The cottage felt like it was holding its breath with her, waiting for her to take the next step. She walked toward the dresser and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were neatly folded sweaters, soft from age. Beneath them, a thin wooden box. She lifted it carefully, her heart tightening. Inside lay slips of paper, some blank, some with symbols, some with quick notes in her grandmother's rushed handwriting. She picked up one fragment and read, symbol equals location, pine knot marking aligned with, underfloor not final chamber. The words chilled her more than the cold spot beneath the cottage. She sifted through the other slips. Some had sketches, maps of the valley, lines of sight, routes marked with arrows. Others had simple warnings written in all caps: burn any copies, do not remove hatch until safe, never alone. Her grandmother had prepared for someone to find these notes. Someone specific. Someone she trusted enough to leave clues for. Elena wasn't sure if that person was meant to be her, or someone else. She closed the box and slid it under her arm. She moved into the living room again, her gaze drawn unwillingly to the rug covering the hidden hatch. The air around it felt colder still, almost as if something below sensed her presence. But she couldn't open it, not yet, not with someone lurking outside. She needed to understand the missing pages first. She needed to know what her grandmother feared, why the diary had been torn apart, why the man in the woods wanted the pages so badly. She returned to the shelves, scanning the spines again. One book leaned slightly out of alignment, a thick blue hardcover. She pulled it free. Inside, she found a false compartment carved into the back cover, hidden beneath glued pages. She inhaled sharply. Inside the compartment lay 3 torn diary pages. Her hands trembled as she unfolded them carefully, the edges brittle with age. The first page read, "The diamonds were never meant to reach the buyers. They were stolen to stop them from funding the killings. If discovered, they will come for blood. Mine first." Elena's pulse hammered. Diamonds, not ordinary, not stolen from a jeweler, stolen from killers. The second page carried tension in every stroke of the pen. They followed me. Valley not safe anymore. I hid the first crate under the floor. The rest must remain scattered. If they find the cellar, it's over. Elena's spine stiffened. There was more than what lay beneath the cottage, more hidden elsewhere, more buried across the valley. She lifted the third page. This one was darker, heavy, final. If Elena ever finds this, she must finish what I could not. Do not trust anyone, especially not the sheriff. The forest remembers. It hides what it must. Her breath broke unevenly, especially not the sheriff. A fresh fear slid through her veins. She was alone in a valley where law enforcement couldn't be trusted, where her grandmother feared a man who still walked through the trees outside her home, where diamonds worth millions lay hidden underfoot, tied to violence, secrets, and bloodshed. She folded the pages gently and clutched them to her chest. The truth wasn't simply buried beneath the cottage. It was scattered across Evergreen Valley, protected by a woman who died trying to keep it out of the wrong hands. And now Elena had inherited all of it. She stepped back to the center of the room, her eyes drifting once more toward the rug. The cold radiating beneath it felt like a heartbeat waiting to be uncovered, but she couldn't open it yet. Not until she understood the rest of the missing pages. Not until she found the clues her grandmother left behind. Not until she was ready to face whatever waited under the floor. Because the forest outside was no longer silent. It was restless, watching, listening. The man in the woods hadn't gone far, and as the last faint strip of daylight disappeared beyond the pines, Elena sensed the valley tighten around her like a closed fist, reminding her that the deeper she looked, the more the truth would begin to cost her. As the night deepened, she felt it rising inside her. Her grandmother's secrets were only the beginning. The cottage felt smaller after Elena read the hidden pages. Too small, too quiet, too aware of her presence. The weight of her grandmother's warnings pressed against the walls like a tightening breath. Every sound seemed amplified, the faint crackle of the wood stove cooling, the soft rattle of the wind against the windowpane, the subtle ticking of an old clock mounted near the doorway. She placed the recovered pages gently inside the diary, sliding them between entries where they seemed to belong, though she couldn't be sure. So much had been removed, so much had been hidden. Her grandmother's life was scattered across these torn fragments, each one a whisper of fear and resolve. Elena closed the diary and held it against her chest, feeling the quiet tremble in her hands. The man in the woods, the sheriff who couldn't be trusted, the diamonds hidden beneath the floor, the valley's scattered caches of something people had killed for. All of it spun through her mind like a storm that had no center. She stood, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet, the sound echoing like a warning. The cold patch beneath the rug pulsed again, faint but noticeable, as if it sensed the diary's return to silence. She walked away from it, needing distance, needing air, needing anything that didn't remind her of secrets buried inches below her. The cottage door groaned softly as she opened it. Outside, night had settled like a thick cloak. The clearing was drenched in shadow, the forest a black wall of unmoving pines. The moon hung low, trapped between the branches, barely strong enough to light a path beyond the porch. The air was colder than before, sharper, as if the valley inhaled the night more deeply than the day. Elena wrapped her arms around herself and stepped onto the porch. The boards beneath her shoes groaned softly, each sound absorbed by the endless darkness. The forest didn't react. It simply watched, the silence thickening the longer she stood there. She let her breath drift into the cold, forming a small cloud that vanished as quickly as it came. The figure she had seen earlier still haunted her thoughts. The slow, deliberate steps, the pause near the cottage, the silence that followed. Whoever he wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He was searching for the same thing she had just found. And he would still be somewhere out there. She scanned the tree line slowly, her pulse rising with every inch her gaze traveled across the shadows. The forest appeared still, but the stillness felt unnatural, too complete, too rehearsed, as though something intelligent hid within it. Her grandmother wrote that the forest learned her footsteps, that it hid what it must. Elena didn't know what that meant. But as she stared into the pines, she felt a strange sensation rising inside her. Not fear, not curiosity, but a subtle prickling, as if the valley recognized her presence and weighed her worth. She stepped back inside, shutting the door tightly behind her. Warmth didn't greet her, only the soft hush of the cottage, the weight of silence pressing down like a blanket woven from decades of secrets. She walked toward the small table near the bookshelf and sat, pulling the diary closer. She opened it again, searching for anything she missed. Symbols, codes, subtle marks. On several pages, faint pencil circles surrounded certain drawings, pine knots, old tree carvings, path markers. She turned one page slowly, her breath catching when she realized the pattern. Each circled symbol appeared near the edges of the drawings, never centered, always subtle, always seemingly insignificant. But when she flipped through the pages quickly, letting the symbols flash one by one before her eyes, they formed something unexpected. A trail. Her grandmother had left a trail hidden in plain sight. Through drawings instead of words, through symbols instead of directions. A trail that wound through the valley, twisted between trees, and eventually her heart stumbled. It led back to the cottage. The path did not begin here. It ended here. Her grandmother had been protecting something that led back to this home, something someone else desperately wanted, something that required markings across the valley to disguise the true center of it all. Elena's gaze drifted again toward the rug covering the hatch. The cold seeped from beneath it like a whisper pulling her forward. She turned another page, searching for anything that explained what exactly was hidden below. But each entry leading toward that truth was torn, ripped, taken. Someone else had tried to follow the trail long before she arrived, someone desperate, someone dangerous, someone who nearly succeeded. She leaned back in the chair, her eyes drifting to the window. The darkness outside felt thicker now, more present, as if the night leaned against the glass with quiet intent. She stood, pacing slowly across the room. Her footsteps felt too loud against the wooden floor, each one echoing through the hollow beneath her. She moved toward the kitchen, opening cupboards and drawers she hadn't checked before. Old jars, salt, flour, herbal tinctures, a small radio that no longer worked, a stack of letters tied with a frayed ribbon, all blank on the outside. She opened them one by one, each filled only with dried lavender. Not a single written page among them. She closed the last envelope and set it aside. Her grandmother had been hiding things everywhere, secrets in books, warnings in boxes, symbols in sketches. But the real truth, the truth she feared the most, was beneath the floor. Elena returned to the center of the room. The rug's corner lifted slightly where she had touched it before, a faint reminder of the hidden hatch beneath. She knelt down slowly, her fingers tracing the fabric. The cold pulse beneath the floor seemed stronger now, an icy breath rising through the boards. She lifted the rug again, revealing the outline of the hatch. The faint groove glimmered slightly in the lamplight. Her grandmother had sealed it tightly, hiding it even from herself for years. But the secrecy had a cost. The missing diary pages, the man in the woods, the warnings carved into her grandmother's words. They were threads leading to this single place. Elena pressed her palm against the hatch. The wood was freezing, a chill so deep it forced her to pull back. Something metallic lay beneath, something untouched for decades, something waiting. The cottage creaked softly behind her. She froze, her breath caught as she listened. The sound was subtle, barely more than a whisper of wood shifting in the night. But then came another, a soft vibration, a faint tremor beneath the floorboards, almost like movement. Her heartbeat slammed painfully. Something was under the cottage, not just objects, not just boxes, movement. She rose quickly, stepping away from the hatch. Her pulse thundered, her breath uneven. The trembling stopped as soon as she moved. The silence returned like a heavy blanket, but she knew she hadn't imagined it. Someone, or something, had caused that vibration. She moved toward the window again, her breath shallow. The forest remained still, giving nothing away. The moonlight cast pale streaks through the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows. She backed away slowly. Fear rose in her chest, but it wasn't the kind that chased her. It was the kind that warned her to stay still, to listen, to understand that she was standing on top of a secret deeply alive in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She turned toward the shelves again, needing distraction, grounding, answers. Her eyes scanned titles until one thin booklet caught her attention. Local folklore and myths of Evergreen Valley. A handwritten note stuck out between the pages. Her grandmother's handwriting. Elena opened the book and unfolded the note. Truth hides where myth is born. Do not ignore the sounds beneath the earth. If you hear it, leave the house immediately. Elena's fingers went numb. The sound beneath the earth, the vibration under the floor, the warning she almost didn't see. Her grandmother wasn't warning her about legends. She wasn't speaking metaphorically. She was speaking literally. Elena clutched the note tightly, her breath trembling. She had heard it. She should have left immediately, but she hadn't. The diary pages whispered danger. The cold spot pulsed beneath her feet. The forest watched through the windows. And the man in the woods was still out there, waiting for the moment she uncovered what he'd been searching for. Elena took a step away from the rug, every instinct screaming at her to run, to leave, to escape before the night grew deeper. But another part of her, the part shaped by desperation, curiosity, and the inheritance she never asked for, held her in place. Her grandmother had spent her life protecting the secret beneath this floor. Now it belonged to her. As darkness pressed harder against the windows and the cold deepened beneath the boards, Elena felt the valley tightening its grip around her. The missing pages had revealed much. But the true danger, the one her grandmother fought until her last breath, was only beginning to surface, and as the final hour of night crept closer, Elena knew one thing with chilling clarity: the floor was no longer just hiding secrets. It was beginning to wake. After a night spent listening to every breath of the wind, every creak of the wood, every shifting whisper of the valley, Elena rose before dawn with a single truth pulsing in her chest. The floor beneath her was no longer a quiet secret. It had changed. Something in that hidden space had stirred when she touched the hatch, as if her presence awakened a long, sleeping memory sealed beneath boards worn thin by the weight of time. Morning light seeped slowly through the curtains, pale and uncertain, as though even the sun was hesitant to intrude upon what the night had revealed. The cottage held its breath around her. The silence was too perfect, too precise, the kind of quiet that felt engineered by fear rather than peace. Elena stepped to the center of the room, the diary pages still clutched tightly in her hand. The rug lay where she had left it, smooth and undisturbed, but she felt the pulse of cold beneath it, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat echoing through stone. She pulled the rug aside again. The outline of the hatch stared up at her, quiet, unassuming, almost innocent, looking, but she knew better. The truth beneath it was tied to danger, to secrets her grandmother died trying to hide, to the footsteps that stalked her through the night. She knelt slowly, pressing her fingers to the groove once more, bracing herself for that sudden frost. It came instantly. A sharp chill shot through her fingertips, crawling up her wrist as though the wood itself was made of ice. She pulled her hand back with a quiet gasp. The cold felt unnatural, not the winter kind, not the mountain kind. It was the cold of untouched metal, buried treasure, sealed vaults, and danger. She forced herself to look closer. The hatch had no obvious latch, no visible hinge, just a faint indentation shaped like a diamond, barely the size of her thumb. She leaned closer, her breath brushing the wood. It wasn't a design. It was a keyhole. Her heart stumbled. The iron key. She rose quickly and crossed to her bag, pulling out the small, ancient key her grandmother sent in the inheritance letter. The metal felt heavier than usual, heavier with meaning. She held it in her palm, studying the carved shape. The head of the key bore a symbol, an angular design she had assumed was decorative, but it matched the indentation on the floor. Her breath trembled. Her grandmother had left her the key not to the cottage, but to what lay beneath it. She returned to the hatch slowly, the key resting cold and solid between her fingers. The cottage seemed to darken around her as she knelt again, aligning the key with the small indentation. Her hand hesitated above it. She wanted answers. She needed to know what her grandmother had been hiding, why she lived in fear, why someone had followed her across states to retrieve something they believed Elena now possessed. But opening the hatch meant stepping into her grandmother's world completely, into the danger, into the darkness, into the truth that had cost lives. She pressed the key into the indentation. It clicked. Not loud, not sharp, just a soft mechanical sigh, as though a lock untouched for decades had finally been given permission to breathe again. The floor trembled beneath her palm, a single shiver, faint but distinct. The hatch loosened. She gripped the edge carefully. At first it resisted, as if years of secrecy had sealed it shut. But then, with a slow groan, it lifted upward, revealing a darkness so complete it felt alive. Cold surged out, a wave of frigid air that swept up her arms, crawling across her skin, prickling every nerve. The scent hit her next, not rot, not mold, but a metallic tang that carried the unmistakable weight of old things buried too long. Elena lowered her head slowly, peering into the void. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, carved from old stone that glimmered faintly under the dim morning light. Cobwebs clung to the walls. Dust swirled upward in quiet spirals, but that wasn't what stole her breath. At the bottom of the stairs, half lit by the faint glow of morning, sat a small metal box, square, rust-kissed, sealed with a clasp her grandmother must have locked decades ago. A box too small to hold anything ordinary, yet too carefully hidden to be insignificant. Her fingers trembled as she took the first step down. Each board above her groaned with her movement. The air grew colder with every inch she descended, until it felt like her breath turned to frost. She kept one hand on the stone wall, letting its chill guide her downward. The box waited at the bottom, resting on a small stone ledge built directly into the earth. The metal shimmered faintly as she reached it, reflecting the sliver of daylight from above. She knelt. Her fingers brushed the lid, cold, almost painfully so, as if the box had been carved from winter itself. She lifted it slowly. It was heavier than she expected. The clasp resisted at first, but after a gentle twist, it gave way with a soft click. The lid opened, and inside her breath froze. Diamonds, a handful of them, scattered across black velvet, glittering even in the faintest light, each one flawless, each one cut with precision, each one worth more money than she had ever seen in her life. She stared, unable to blink, unable to breathe. Her grandmother had hidden diamonds beneath her home, not one, not two, dozens. Her mind raced. The diary warned of a burden beneath the floor, of something cost too much blood, of they came again tonight, of monsters should not inherit power. These weren't ordinary diamonds. These were stolen. These were hunted. These were the reason someone stalked her grandmother, the reason someone followed Elena through the night, the reason men had died. She ran her fingertips through them gently, their cold brilliance biting her skin. Each one was a story she didn't yet know, a danger she hadn't yet understood. She reached deeper inside the box, feeling for anything hidden beneath the jewels. Her fingers brushed paper, a folded note. Her chest tightened as she opened it slowly, her grandmother's handwriting sweeping across the page in hurried strokes. This is only a fragment. Do not search for the rest unless you are prepared to face them. They killed for what they lost. Protect this at all costs. It must never be returned. More lies deeper. If they find you, run. Elena felt the sound before she heard it, a low hum, a distant vibration. Not coming from the box, not from the hatch, from above, a car engine. Her pulse surged violently. She dropped the note, grabbed the box, and hurried up the stairs, each step thudding dully beneath her feet. Her heart hammered as she shoved the hatch closed just as gravel crunched outside the cottage. She froze, the box pressed tightly against her chest, her grandmother's diamonds, her grandmother's warning, her grandmother's burden. Footsteps approached the porch, slow, measured, unmistakably human. The boards creaked under a weight not her own. Elena pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath, clutching the box as if it were the only weapon she possessed. The doorknob turned softly once, twice, testing. Her grandmother's final words echoed through her, a whisper carried across time, across secrets, across fear. If they find you, run. But there was nowhere to run. Not yet. The door creaked open, just an inch. Silence followed, a silence that felt colder than the diamonds in her hands. Elena tightened her grip, her breath trembling as the shadow on the porch slowly stretched across the floor. And the morning in Evergreen Valley revealed the truth she could no longer escape. She was no longer searching for answers. Someone else had come searching for her. The door remained cracked open, just a thin sliver of space, yet the entire room seemed to tilt toward it, drawn by the quiet danger standing on the other side. Elena pressed herself harder against the wall. The cold metal box clutched against her chest so tightly it hurt. Her breath came shallow, barely a whisper, as she watched the shadow stretching across the floorboards like a dark hand reaching toward her. Whoever stood on that porch wasn't testing the door anymore. They were listening, waiting. The air grew impossibly still, heavy enough to make her ears ring. Then, a soft metallic sound, a click, a weight shifting against the doorknob, a breath, one not her own. Elena's pulse shot through her like lightning. The shadow moved again, inching forward with slow, deliberate precision. The presence felt familiar, not the warmth of someone she knew, nor the neutrality of a stranger, but the cold, calculated silence of someone who had done this before. Someone who had opened doors they had no right to open. Someone who had broken into apartments before dawn and sifted through lives they intended to steal from. Someone who already knew her grandmother was dead, and believed the diamonds were now hers. Another faint creak slipped from the porch boards, followed by the slow exhale of a man who carried purpose in every breath. Elena held still, her heartbeat pounding in the back of her throat. The cottage wood groaned softly as the door shifted a hair wider. She could see a palm now, a few fingers, a sleeve of dark fabric, enough to know the man wasn't large but strong, methodical, patient. Someone who moved like a hunter, a person who had learned long ago that silence was a weapon. Her fingers curled tighter around the box. The diamonds inside shifted softly. The sound was almost nothing, barely more than a whisper. Yet it felt louder than thunder in the stillness of the cottage. The man paused, every muscle in Elena's body locked. A moment passed long, sharp, suspended, then footsteps retreated, slowly at first, then with more confidence as he stepped back off the porch. Gravel crunched under his boots. His shadow swept away from the door. Elena inched closer, unable to tear her gaze from the narrow opening. The man hadn't left. She knew it before she even reached the entrance. The forest didn't swallow him. The silence didn't relax. He was still out there, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. She eased the door closed until the latch caught, sealing the cottage once more in its fragile shell of wooden walls and old secrets. Her breath shuddered out of her chest, her knees trembling beneath her. She backed away from the entrance, still listening for footsteps, but the forest only returned a muffled quiet. She set the metal box gently on the table, the diamonds inside settling like glints of frozen fire. She couldn't look at them, not yet. She felt exposed just having them out of the floor, vulnerable, as if the cottage walls themselves knew those stones had brought danger into this valley long before she arrived. She pushed the box aside and leaned forward, bracing her hands on the table. The cold wood grounded her slightly, but not enough to quiet the storm inside her. Her grandmother had built a life around hiding these diamonds. Her diary spoke of bloodshed, warnings, coded trails through the forest. Now those secrets were no longer buried, not completely, and the man who hunted them knew she was here. Elena forced herself to breathe. One inhale, one exhale, just enough to think. She turned toward the small window beside the bookshelf and pulled back the curtain gently. The forest stared back at her, its darkness swallowing the morning light. Not a single branch moved, not a single bird sang, not a single flicker of life stirred among the pines. Nothing except one thing: footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to her porch and then circling the perimeter of the cottage as if someone had walked every inch around the walls, tracing the boundaries, mapping the structure, searching for weaknesses. And then the prints ended at the window she was standing beside. Her breath hitched violently, a soft gasp escaping her. The man had stood right here, just inches away from her, in the dark, watching. She let the curtain fall, hands shaking uncontrollably. He knew where she slept, where she hid, where she hesitated. Her grandmother's diary whispered back at her in her memory, "Do not trust the sheriff. They keep searching. If they find you, run." But where could she run? The valley stretched for miles in every direction with nothing but dense forest, abandoned paths, and hidden danger. The nearest town was an hour away. Her car was still parked at the end of the twisting trail, too exposed, too isolated. If she made it that far, he would see her. The moment she stepped into the clearing, he'd have the advantage. She sat slowly, pulling the diary toward her again. Her grandmother's entries were frantic near the end, her words heavy with urgency. Not all diamonds were meant to shine. Some were meant to disappear. The wrong hands will bleed the valley for them. Elena swallowed hard, glancing toward the metal box. The diamonds inside were beautiful in a cold, deceptive way, too perfect, too pure. But her grandmother's warnings wrapped around them like a shroud. These stones weren't symbols of wealth. They were symbols of war, of theft, of betrayal, of survival. She crept toward the window again and peeked through the narrowest sliver. Her pulse raced as she scanned the forest. That's when she saw him, a figure standing between the trees, motionless, blending with the shadows, but unmistakably human, not hiding, not approaching, simply watching the cottage with the patience of someone who had no need to rush. Her breath left her in a sharp, silent exhale. He wasn't leaving, he was waiting, listening, studying, planning his return. A hunter rarely acted on impulse. He acted on openings, on patterns, on fear. And Elena could practically feel him reading her every hesitation. She closed the curtain gently and backed away from the window, her thoughts spinning. She needed to protect the box. She needed to protect herself. She needed to understand her grandmother's last choices, and she needed to do it all without letting fear paralyze her. She grabbed the box and slipped into the bedroom, setting it on the quilt for just a moment. The cold inside the cabin intensified around her as if the diamonds themselves radiated danger. She crouched on the floor, pulling her grandmother's backpack from beneath the bed. A small canvas bag meant for hiking trails, weathered but sturdy. She opened it, examining the worn straps, the frayed seams. It wasn't meant for travel. It was meant for escaping. A second letter lay inside, a sealed envelope with her name written on it in her grandmother's perfectly measured handwriting. Elena froze. She pulled it out carefully, her hands trembling as she broke the seal. Inside was a single line: "If you open the floor, they will come. Do not let them take the box. Protect it with your life, or leave the valley before nightfall." Elena's vision blurred for a moment, the words striking her like a blow. Leave the valley before nightfall. The message was clear. Her grandmother had known exactly how quickly danger would return once the hatch was opened. She glanced toward the window again, imagining the silent figure still standing there, waiting for dusk, waiting for darkness to cloak his next move. She shoved the letter deep into the backpack, then placed the metal box inside, wrapping it in layers of cloth to keep the diamonds from clinking. Her grandmother hadn't given her this cottage as a gift. She had given her a responsibility, a task, a burden wrapped in velvet and sealed with fear. Elena zipped the bag shut. The sky outside brightened faintly, but the valley's darkness didn't ease. It pressed against the cottage like a reminder. Time was slipping away. The man outside wouldn't risk breaking in while the sun hovered above the trees. But when darkness fell, he would return. That much was certain. She needed to make a choice: stay and risk everything, or leave, and risk losing the truth her grandmother died protecting. Her heartbeat steadied slightly as she lifted the bag onto her shoulder. The valley waited for her answer. The forest watched. The footsteps outside memorized her every move. The diamonds in the bag weighed more than stone. They weighed like a destiny she hadn't chosen. Elena stepped to the center of the room, letting the cold pulse beneath the floor whisper one last reminder of the secrets buried deeper still. As she tightened her grip on the strap, she knew one thing with chilling clarity: the man outside wasn't her only danger. The valley held more than one pair of watching eyes, and the deeper she stepped into her grandmother's legacy, the more she understood this was only the first fragment. The real truth waited beneath layers she hadn't yet uncovered. And as the sun traced weak lines across the forest floor, Elena realized something that sent a cold shiver crawling through her spine. The boxes beneath the floor were only the beginning. After packing her grandmother's metal box into the canvas bag, Elena stepped toward the door with a steady breath that didn't match the chaos beating inside her chest. The forest outside remained unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from caution. Like the valley itself, new danger was circling the cottage and held its breath to avoid being noticed. She cracked the door open just enough to let a thin strand of cold morning air slip inside. It brushed against her skin with a sharpness that felt almost intelligent, almost aware. She scanned the clearing again, every muscle tight, every thought sharpening, as though her mind understood what her voice could not yet say out loud. The man was gone, at least from sight, but his presence lingered, etched into the fresh footprints, that pressed clearly into the soft earth. They trailed from the tree line to the porch, looping around the cottage like a silent perimeter sweep. Whoever he was, he didn't wander blindly. He knew what he was looking for. His path was purposeful, calculated, steady. Her grandmother's last instructions repeated in her mind like a broken whisper. Leave before nightfall. Do not trust anyone, not even the sheriff. If they find you, run. Elena tightened her grip on the strap of the bag and stepped out onto the porch, her boots sinking slightly into the damp wood. The cold clung to her throat as she descended the steps and followed the footprints around the cottage. They were deep, heavy, made by someone strong. She followed them to the edge of the clearing, and that's where her breath froze. A second set of footprints joined the first, smaller, sharper, fresher. 2 people had been here, one watching the cottage, one circling the forest edge. She stared at the overlapping tracks, dread curling through her stomach like smoke. Whoever her grandmother feared, whoever the missing diary pages warned her about, there were more than one, and they were organized. She crouched down, brushing her fingers lightly across the newer prints. The soil was disturbed, the edges sharp, the impressions filled with water from a morning dew that hadn't existed long enough to smooth them. Someone had been here minutes ago, not hours, minutes. She straightened slowly, her breath trembling in the air. The forest loomed before her, tall and unmoving, 1,000 shadows woven into roots and branches. Her eyes scanned each tree trunk, each flicker of light between the pines, searching for even the smallest trace of movement. Nothing, but still she felt watched. She stepped back toward the path leading to her car, her heartbeat picking up pace. The gravel crunch beneath her boots sounded far too loud in the silence. She pushed through a cluster of ferns and followed the winding route to the parking area tucked between thick clusters of conifers. And the moment she reached the crest of the small hill overlooking her car, she stopped dead. Tire tracks, deep skid marks, an indentation in the mud where someone had stood for a long time. Someone had been here too. Her hands curled into fists as she descended the hill slowly. She approached her car with caution, scanning it from a distance. Nothing was broken, nothing was slashed, no windows shattered, no doors open, but the driver's side door, it wasn't fully shut. Her pulse slammed through her chest. She approached carefully, every step deliberate, every muscle tense. The forest held its breath as though urging her to turn back. She reached out and gently nudged the door. It swung open. Her breath caught sharply, her body freezing in place. Inside, the glove compartment hung open, papers spilling onto the seat. Her registration, her insurance, receipts, everything pulled out, examined, discarded. Whoever searched her car wasn't looking for money, not for valuables, not for the keys. They were looking for something connected to the diamonds. A map, a note, a clue, or the box itself. They hadn't found it, not yet. She backed away slowly, her gaze flicking across the forest again. 2 people, one at the cottage, one at the car, coordinated. Not desperate thieves, not curious locals, professionals. The word formed slowly in her chest like a stone dropping into dark water. Her grandmother had been hunted by people like this. Her grandmother had hidden thousands of dollars in diamonds beneath her feet to keep them away from monsters. Her grandmother had spent decades hiding, watching, protecting the valley from their reach. Now Elena was caught in the center of the same circle. She closed the car door quietly and stepped away, her instinct screaming that getting inside the vehicle would be a mistake. Too exposed, too predictable, too easy to ambush. If someone had been inside the car once, nothing stopped them from waiting nearby now. She turned toward the path that led deeper into the valley. The wind shifted suddenly, brushing her cheek with a cold whisper. Pine needles rustled softly overhead. The sound carried with it a subtle rhythm, almost like a breath. Not hers. From behind her, she spun sharply. A figure stood at the far end of the clearing, still, tall, motionless. A man dressed in a dark jacket, hands at his sides, head tilted slightly as he watched her. Elena couldn't see his face through the shadows, but she didn't need to. The rigid posture, the unreadable stillness, it was the same presence she had sensed outside the cottage. Her pulse spiked violently. For a moment neither of them moved. The valley fell silent again, as if sealing them inside its ancient, unbroken quiet. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening not to sound but to intention. Elena took one slow step backward. The man did nothing. She took another, still nothing, but the slight tilt of his head, the slight shift of his weight, the faint glint of light reflecting off something near his wrist. He wasn't observing. He was calculating, watching how she reacted, watching the distance between them, watching the bag slung over her shoulder, the bag containing the diamonds. He knew what she carried. A cold, hollow panic rose through her chest, gripping her lungs like a fist. She steadied her breathing, forcing her voice inside her mind to remain clear, steady, sharp. Run. But she didn't. Not yet. Running would provoke him. Running would confirm she held something valuable. Running would expose her position in the open clearing. She forced her steps to remain slow as she turned back toward the cottage. The man didn't chase, he simply watched. Every hair on her body rose, her skin prickling with the silent understanding that she had woken a hunt she did not know how to escape. She reached the porch, her breath trembling as she turned to look again. He was gone, vanished into the trees without a sound. Elena backed into the cottage and shut the door, locking it, sliding the bolts across, pressing her weight against the wood as though her body alone could keep the danger out. Her heart hammered, her breathing stuttered, her hands shook. She grabbed the nearest object for support, the back of a wooden chair, and sank into it, her body trembling from shock and adrenaline. The valley was no longer simply quiet. It was dangerous. Her grandmother's diary had not exaggerated. Her grandmother had not imagined threats. Her grandmother had not left these warnings for nothing. The men looking for the diamonds did not take kindly to being denied. Elena looked toward the window where his silhouette had vanished. He would be back. They both would, with more darkness, with more intent, with more determination, and she couldn't rely on the isolation of the cottage to protect her. She needed help, even if her grandmother warned against it. Her fingers fumbled for her phone. She stared at the cracked screen, battling the instinct to ignore her grandmother's warning. Do not trust the sheriff. But who else could she call? She swallowed hard. The only person who might listen, the only authority she could report suspicious activity to, the only official presence in Evergreen Valley, the sheriff. Elena exhaled, her hand trembling as she unlocked her phone. Danger encircled the cottage like wolves. The man in the trees was a shadow she couldn't outrun, and the diamonds beneath the floor were only the beginning. As she dialed the sheriff's number, she felt the weight of her grandmother's caution pressing down like a heavy hand on her shoulder. Because whether the sheriff came to help her or to hunt what she carried, one thing had become terrifyingly clear. The shadows in the trees were closing in, and Elena no longer had the luxury of standing still. The ringing barely lasted a second before the sheriff answered, his voice rough with morning fatigue. Evergreen County Sheriff's Office. Elena's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the phone as though it might slip straight from her trembling hand. She forced her voice steady, shaping it into something that sounded almost calm, almost reasonable. "There's someone on my property," she said quietly, her words thin but urgent. "Two people, I think. They were watching the cottage. One of them searched my car. I am not safe out here." A pause followed, too long, too measured to belong to someone hearing a distress call for the first time. Then, "Slow down, tell me exactly what you saw." The tone wasn't concerned. It wasn't protective. It was clinical, controlled, as though he were trying to place her voice in a file he'd already mentally organized. She swallowed hard. "Two men," she said. "Dark clothing. One of them tried the door. They walked around the cottage. Their footprints are everywhere. Someone was inside my car." Another silence followed, this one shorter, but heavier somehow, as if he already knew who she was talking about. "Stay inside," he said at last. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. It might as well have been 20 hours. Before she could speak again, the line clicked dead. The abruptness of it cut through her like a blade, leaving a chill that had nothing to do with the cold in the valley. He didn't ask how far the men had gotten. He didn't ask if she was armed. He didn't ask if she needed an escort back to town. He simply promised to come and ended the call as if the conversation were a routine annoyance. She lowered the phone slowly, dread gathering in her chest like heavy fog. Her grandmother's warning pulsed like a bruise inside her memory. Do not trust the sheriff. But she had already invited him to her doorstep. The cottage swallowed her silence. She stared out the window again, her breath fogging the glass as she scanned the forest for any trace of the man she had seen. The trees gave nothing away. No movement, no sound, no sign the valley held more than wind and old shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched hadn't faded. If anything, it thickened, like the air itself had eyes. She stepped away from the window and reached for the backpack again, pulling it close. The weight of the diamonds inside pressed against her palm, colder than before, as if they held their own breathless anticipation. The cottage creaked. A long, low groan from the rafters. She froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't settling wood. It was the wrong kind of sound, shallow, hesitant, like someone had placed weight somewhere they shouldn't. Her heart slammed upward. She tilted her head, listening. Another creak. Higher this time, above her, the attic, her blood iced. She stepped backward slowly, pressing herself against the wall as she stared at the ceiling. A faint shadow shifted between the cracks in the old wooden planks overhead. Fear crawled up her spine, cold and deliberate. Someone was in the attic. Her breath tightened, barely escaping through parted lips. She clutched the backpack to her chest, her mind racing. The sheriff wasn't here yet. The men outside were watching, and now someone was inside the house above her, moving with the same patience, the same calculated stillness she'd seen in the clearing. Her grandmother's diary entries echoed loud and fast. "They keep searching. Voices above me. If they reach the house, hide everything." Elena backed toward the fireplace, eyes fixed on the ceiling as a third creak sounded, this one unmistakably closer to the attic hatch. Her mind sharpened with adrenaline. There were two possibilities. Someone had slipped inside while she was outside searching the clearing. Or someone had been inside the cottage the entire night. Her throat tightened at the second possibility. She tried to remember every sound she had heard while she lay awake, every creak, every whisper of wood shifting in the dark. Had someone been walking softly overhead while she sat reading the diary, while she knelt at the hatch? While she slept, the thought made her stomach twist violently. Another quiet shift echoed overhead, a heel, a step, someone testing the boards, slow, silent, trying not to give themselves away. Her pulse thudded painfully against her ribs. If she made a sound, they would hear it. If she moved too quickly, they would move faster. She had to think. She had to breathe. She had to protect the diamonds and survive long enough to learn the truth behind her grandmother's death. She backed toward the bedroom, every step gentle, every breath measured. The ceiling remained still, no whisper of movement, no hint of the shadow above reacting. Whoever they were waiting too. Listening, studying, she slipped into the bedroom and closed the door quietly, sliding the small latch across even though she knew it would do little. The backpack thudded softly as she set it on the bed, her hands trembling. Her grandmother's envelope peeked from the side pocket, its torn seal whispering warnings she should have heeded sooner. She pulled it out and reread the final line, "If they find you, run." But she couldn't run. Not yet. Not until she knew which direction was safe, and which one led straight into their arms. A soft thump upstairs shattered the thought. Elena's breath snagged violently. The attic hatch was near the hallway. If the person above opened it, they would come down just feet from where she stood. The sheriff would arrive in 17 minutes, if he was trustworthy, if he wasn't connected to the same people hunting the diamonds. She moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside with trembling fingers. The forest still looked empty, but shadows lied. Elena held her breath again, her fingers gripping the windowsill. Another sound. Not from above this time, from the front porch, a soft step, then another. Panic jolted through her ribs. 2 people, one overhead, one outside. Her grandmother had been hunted by more than one man. They had worked in pairs then. They were working in pairs now. She ducked instinctively as a silhouette, wet past the bedroom window. Too close. Her breath came out ragged. The man paused, stood completely still, as though sensing her movement inside. Elena pressed her back against the wall and waited, every nerve ablaze. A few seconds passed, heavy and suffocating, before his shadow finally continued past the window and disappeared around the cabin. Above her, another creak sounded. They were tightening their circle. She steadied herself with one hand against the headboard, forcing her mind to sharpen through the panic. She had only minutes to choose what kind of person she would be in this valley, the hunted or the survivor. Her grandmother hadn't survived by hiding. She had survived by outsmarting them, by staying one step ahead, by turning her isolation into strength. Elena wiped the sweat from her brow and crouched low, pulling the backpack against her stomach. The attic creaked again, but this time further away toward the opposite side of the cottage. An opportunity, a tiny window of escape before they moved again. She slipped silently to the other side of the bedroom, pushing the curtain aside once more just enough to see the tree line. The forest edge looked empty, but the valley trained her not to trust silence. She grabbed the old quilt from the bed, balled it, and wedged it under the door, muffling sound from inside the room so her footsteps wouldn't echo through the cottage. Her grandmother had lived here long enough to turn fear into caution. Elena had to do the same if she wanted to live long enough to uncover the truth. With one final breath, she unlocked the bedroom window. Cold air rushed in, carrying the forest's metallic scent. Pine needles swayed gently in the breeze. The attic creaked again, closer this time. The shadow outside passed the porch again. Elena didn't hesitate. She slipped through the window, quiet, controlled, careful, and dropped into the soft layer of pine needles below. The forest muffled her landing. She crouched low, eyes scanning every shadow. Nothing moved. Not yet. She kept low and crept along the side of the cottage, the backpack pulled tight against her spine. Every step was deliberate, measured, silent. She didn't breathe fully until she reached the back of the cottage, where the trees thickened into a wall of dark green. Then a voice, a man's voice, low, calm, deadly, "She's not here." Another answer followed, just as quiet, just as cold. She didn't get far. Elena's pulse exploded. They were already inside the cottage. They had opened the front door. The sheriff wasn't here. The attic wasn't their entry. It was their advantage. She pressed herself deeper into the brush as the first man stepped back onto the porch. "We find the box," he murmured. "Nothing else matters." The second man stepped into view, his silhouette rigid, and the girl, a pause. Leave no witnesses. Elena's world froze. Cold swept through her veins like ice water. She clamped a hand over her mouth to silence the small, involuntary gasp that threatened to escape. They weren't just here for the diamonds. They were here to kill her. Her grandmother had known. She had warned her. The missing pages weren't fear. They were prophecy. Elena closed her eyes, letting the truth settle with devastating clarity. She didn't need the sheriff. She didn't need to run blindly. She needed a plan. And as the men re-entered the cottage, their footsteps shifting across the porch, Elena slipped deeper into the forest, aware that from this moment forward, every breath she took belonged to a battle her grandmother fought long before she was born. The shadows in the trees weren't just watching anymore. They were hunting. Elena moved through the trees with the terrified precision of someone whose life depended on silence. Every step pressed into the pine needles with painstaking care, every breath released only when the wind moved enough to mask it. The forest was colder here, colder than any valley morning should be, its shadows clinging to the earth like the remnants of a long, forgotten secret. Behind her, the cottage swallowed the footsteps of the men searching it. Their voices drifted faintly through the trees, low and deliberate, carried on the brittle morning air. We find the box, and the girl, leave no witnesses. The words stabbed through her mind with chilling clarity. Elena moved faster, deeper into the trees, weaving between thick trunks as her heartbeat thundered beneath her ribs. The backpack weighed against her spine, every step reminding her of the diamonds inside. The diamonds her grandmother had nearly died protecting. The forest thinned slightly as she reached the far edge of the clearing behind the cottage. She crouched behind a fallen trunk, letting her breath slow until her vision steadied. The world around her held its quiet, eerie tension. She needed a plan. She couldn't stay in the forest. The men would sweep the area soon. She couldn't run for the car. They knew the path. She couldn't call the sheriff. Her grandmother's warning echoed like a bruise, "Do not trust him." And she couldn't carry the diamonds without knowing what they meant. Her grandmother hadn't chosen this cottage by accident. If the hatch held only a fraction, if the valley held more caches, then the true answer wasn't in running. It was in understanding what her grandmother hid. Footsteps sounded again from the cottage. A door slammed open. Wood splintered as something heavy was dragged across the floor. They were searching with purpose. They knew exactly where to look. They knew her grandmother too well. Elena steadied herself and scanned the clearing again, forcing her mind to sharpen despite the panic. The cottage had secrets hidden under the floor. But her grandmother's diary spoke of more than one chamber. Underfloor, not final chamber. If there was something deeper, if there was another hiding place, then her grandmother must have used the cottage itself as a map. Her gaze drifted slowly along the back wall of the cottage. A stone chimney rose from the ground, solid, weathered, but not fully aligned with the interior fireplace, and beside it, half concealed by thick moss, sat an old wooden structure she hadn't noticed before. A small shed. It leaned slightly, its timbers mottled by time, its roof sagging inward. But something about it felt wrong in a way that pulled her forward, wrong like a deliberate disguise. Elena crept toward it, the backpack secured tightly against her spine, her breath light as she pressed through a curtain of vines. She reached the shed door and tested the handle. Unlocked. She opened it slowly. The scent hit her first, a thick, stale mixture of dust, damp earth, and something else. Something old, something guarded. The inside was nearly empty except for a few rusted farming tools, a pile of firewood, and stacks of forgotten boxes. But beneath the scent, beneath the dust, beneath the stillness, something else lingered. Something metallic, something cold, something that matched the scent beneath the cottage floor. Her heart quickened. She stepped inside. The air was colder than it should have been. The sunlight barely reached past the threshold, leaving most of the shed washed in a grey half-shadow. Elena's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the clutter. Nothing moved, no footprints, no sign anyone had entered recently, but the cold, sharp, unnatural, familiar, hung over everything like a warning. She moved toward the back of the shed, brushing aside cobwebs as she examined the floorboards. Something hollow answered beneath her weight. A faint echo, not wood, not earth, a chamber. Her breath hitched. She knelt and brushed dust away, revealing wooden planks worn smooth, not by time but by hands. Someone had opened this hatch, not recently, but often enough that the edges remained soft. Her grandmother. This was the second chamber. She searched for a latch or lever, but the boards were seamless. No breaks, no patterns. Then she saw it. Carved along the corner of one plank, almost invisible beneath the dust, a symbol, the same symbol from the diary sketches, a pine knot marking. Elena pressed her fingertips against it. The groove shifted gently under pressure, unlocking with a faint click. The hatch lifted. Cold air surged upward, colder than the morning, colder than the cottage, colder than the stones beneath the forest floor. It carried the same metallic scent, multiplied tenfold. She peered downward. A narrow ladder descended into a dark space where no light reached. The edges of stone walls glimmered faintly, coated with frost that hadn't melted in years. The cellar was deeper than the first chamber, larger, older, carved into the earth with precision her grandmother couldn't have accomplished alone. Someone had helped her once. Elena gripped the ladder and descended slowly, each rung freezing against her palms. The temperature dropped with every foot she climbed down, sinking into her bones, tightening her breath. When her feet touched solid ground, the low cellar unfolded before her like a forgotten vault. Crates lined the walls, dozens of them, stacked neatly, untouched for years. Some were wrapped in cut velvet, some sealed with wax, some marked with strange symbols she didn't recognize. The deeper she stepped, the colder it became. The crate nearest to her carried a faded label smudged by time, Hale and Emerson Trading Co. Her grandmother had never once spoken of a trading company, never mentioned partners, never hinted at involvement in anything that required secrecy or coded symbols. And yet here, beneath the foundation of her cottage, proof of something larger stretched across the walls. Elena lifted the lid of a crate slowly. Inside lay dozens of small velvet pouches tied with string. She untied one with trembling fingers and spilled the contents onto her palm. More diamonds, a cascade of cold, glittering stones that caught even the faintest light like shards of ice. She steadied herself against the crate, her breath trembling in her lungs. This was no accidental inheritance, no forgotten stash, no sentimental legacy. This was a fortune, a stolen fortune. Her grandmother had been far more than a quiet woman living in the woods. She had been the guardian of something vast, something dangerous, something that could topple far more than Elena understood. Elena closed the pouch and set it back into the crate, forcing her mind to remain clear. She needed answers. She needed the story, not just the treasure. She scanned the room again. Along the far wall sat a wooden table, warped slightly with age. Papers lay scattered across its surface, maps, ledgers, ink-stained documents. She stepped closer, her eyes catching on the largest piece, a ledger, thick, bound in leather. She opened it slowly. Names filled the columns, names crossed out, names circled, names annotated. Beside them, amounts in neatly written ink. Hundreds, thousands, millions, transactions. Her grandmother had recorded every diamond, every exchange, every shipment, and at the very bottom of one page, written in a hurried slant, if found, protect them, they cost too much blood. A chill racked her spine. Her grandmother wasn't hiding treasure. She was preserving evidence, evidence of a criminal network, one powerful enough to kill for silence, one ruthless enough to hunt a dying woman in the woods. Elena turned another page and stopped. This one contained a list of dates and locations, each paired with a red mark. She recognized some of the locations. Small towns in nearby states. Others were foreign, and next to one entry, written shakily, "Last shipment intercepted. They will come for me." Elena lowered the ledger slowly, feeling the weight of fear sink into her bones. The men searching the cottage weren't thieves. They weren't treasure hunters. They were part of the network. Her grandmother had stolen their diamonds. She had collected proof of their crimes, and she had hidden it in the valley, piece by piece, knowing they would never stop searching. Elena's breath broke softly. She stepped backward, gripping the backpack tighter, her mind racing. Above her, the world remained fragile. Cottage walls too thin to protect her, forest shadows too thick to trust, strangers closing in with practiced precision. She wasn't only running from danger now. She was guarding the last truth her grandmother ever preserved. The truth those men had killed for. The truth they would kill for again. Elena steeled herself and climbed the ladder, her breath forming clouds in the frozen air. When she reached the top, she closed the hatch, locked it, and covered it with dust until the floor looked untouched. Then she pressed her ear to the shed door and listened. The forest had gone silent again. Not peaceful, not safe, silent like a held breath, silent like a trap waiting to spring. She slipped out of the shed and into the cold morning, knowing with absolute certainty she wasn't the only one touching her grandmother's secrets today. She wasn't the only one learning the truth, and the men in the trees would return for far more than the box she carried. As she crossed back toward the cottage, the valley exhaled a quiet warning, one she felt not in her ears but in her bones. Whatever her grandmother had hidden, the cost of uncovering it had only just begun. Elena moved through the trees toward the cottage with a new weight on her shoulders, heavier even than the diamonds pressed against her spine. Knowledge. Not the comforting kind, not the healing kind, but the kind that trapped her between the world she thought she knew and a darker undercurrent pulsing beneath Evergreen Valley. Her grandmother hadn't hidden diamonds for personal gain. She had hidden them to protect the world from the men who stole them, men who now hunted Elena with the same precision. The forest thinned as she approached the clearing again. The cottage stood quietly, wrapped in the soft gold light, leaking through the branches. But the stillness felt wrong. Too clean, too emptied of life, too aware of her return. Elena crouched behind a moss-covered boulder, scanning the area. The men had vanished. No movement in the windows. No shadows slipping across the porch. No soft crunch of footsteps in the frost. Only silence. Dangerous, calculated silence. She waited until her heartbeat slowed into something steady enough to trust, then rose and stepped toward the cottage. The wind brushed through the pines above her, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of the cold cellar she had just left. It clung to her skin as though the valley wanted her to remember exactly how deep her grandmother's secrets ran. As she reached the porch, she noticed the faintest crack in the wood near the door, fresh, the splinter pale against the weathered grain. They had kicked it, forced it, broken the lock. She bolted. She pressed her ear lightly against the door. Nothing, not even the soft tick of settling wood. She slid inside. The cottage interior had been transformed into a battlefield of quiet violence. The rug was thrown aside. Drawers hung open, contents spilled across the floor. Every cupboard, every shelf, every hidden corner had been searched with surgical precision. They didn't just want the box. They wanted every clue her grandmother might have left behind. Elena closed the door behind her, locking it only for the fragile illusion of safety. The golden afternoon light spilled slowly across the floorboards, illuminating the chaos. They had torn apart her grandmother's careful life in minutes. She steadied herself, forcing her breaths to deepen. She crossed the room slowly, her attention fixed on the hatch beneath the rug. They hadn't found it. They had searched everywhere else, every drawer, every cabinet, every shadowed corner, but the one thing they hadn't touched was the floor. Because they didn't know about the key, her grandmother had hidden the truth not through complexity, but through familiarity. No one would ever guess a solid cottage floor had a lock. Elena brushed the rug back over the hatch. She couldn't risk them returning and discovering it. She knelt to straighten its edges, her fingers moving automatically, her mind caught between the cellar's cold truth and the danger closing in from all sides. Her gaze swept the room again. Something glittered beneath the overturned bookshelf. She leaned down and retrieved it, a shard of glass from a broken picture frame. Behind it sat the photograph that once rested above the fireplace. She lifted it carefully. It showed her grandmother standing in the same clearing Elena now occupied, the cottage behind her, her eyes sharp with a clarity Elena had never seen in person. One arm rested around a man, her age, maybe younger, with stern eyes and a cigarette between two fingers. The same name etched on the ledger, Hale and Emerson Trading Co. Emerson, the partner, the one person her grandmother trusted enough to bury secrets with, the man whose name appeared beside half the ledger entries. But the last notation beside his name had been slashed out with angry ink. Had he betrayed her grandmother? Had he died? Had the men now stalking the valley once worked for him? Elena traced her grandmother's face with a trembling thumb. Every truth she uncovered pulled her deeper into a world where friendship had turned into enmity, and stolen diamonds had turned into a war. She set the photograph aside and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to glance outside. Dusk approached rust, colored light dripping through the trees, washing the entire valley in copper. Night would come fast, and they would come with it. She stepped away from the window, forcing herself to think. The cellar held more diamonds, too many to carry, too many to defend alone. The box in her bag was only a fraction of her grandmother's burden, but she couldn't leave it behind, not when she finally understood its importance. Her grandmother hadn't tried to solve the mystery, she had tried to bury it, and now those men wanted to unearth it one piece at a time. Elena's gaze drifted to the table where the ledger lay open to the last written page. She stepped closer. Something new caught her eye, ink faintly smeared, as though someone had touched the page with damp fingers just minutes earlier. A single line stood out at the bottom. If I am gone, the valley becomes the last witness. Elena closed her eyes. Her grandmother hadn't been speaking poetically. The valley literally held the evidence. Diamonds scattered in hidden cellars, ledgers full of names, maps marking the locations of every cache. And the men hunting Elena weren't just trying to reclaim stolen property. They were trying to erase the last record of their crimes. If they found the cellar, every life her grandmother protected would be wasted. Elena snapped her eyes open. Footsteps crunched outside, slow, steady, approaching the porch. Her blood turned cold. She grabbed the backpack and moved toward the fireplace, pressing herself into the corner. She controlled her breathing, listening. Another step, and another. A shadow passed across the window. The handle of the front door twitched. Her pulse quickened, each beat a flash of heat beneath her skin. She held the backpack tighter, as if the weight of the box inside could protect her from what was about to come next. The door handle twisted again, harder this time. Metal groaned, wood strained, then it stopped. Silence followed, a long, bone-deep silence, then a new sound, soft, rhythmic, barely audible, breathing. Someone was standing on the other side of the door, listening for her. She covered her mouth, forcing the tremble out of her lungs. Every instinct screamed to move, to run, to escape. But instinct meant noise, and noise meant discovery. The breathing continued, slow and patient. the kind of breathing belonging to someone who had waited years to claim what lay beneath this cottage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. Not far, just enough to reposition. Elena exhaled slowly, carefully moving toward the back door. The men had searched the cottage earlier. They would assume she'd flee through the front or the forest path. They wouldn't expect the narrow, vine-covered exit behind the kitchen. She eased it open, letting dusk spill into the cottage. The cold valley air hit her skin like a warning. The forest stirred quietly. Shadows lengthened like fingers reaching across the ground. She stepped outside and slipped behind the cottage wall, moving low, moving quick, moving with a new understanding she wasn't running from danger. She was moving toward the truth. The cellar had been only the beginning, and as she pressed deeper into the trees, putting the cottage behind her, Elena felt a weight settle inside her chest that was stronger than fear. Her grandmother had left her a legacy of secrets, but Elena was learning something her grandmother had never written in her diary. The valley itself was a map, the forest a witness, the truth scattered under roots and stone. And the men stalking her weren't hunting diamonds. They were hunting the last living person who could expose everything. As the wind swept cold through the trees and the night began to fall, Elena realized she wasn't just inheriting the cottage. She was inheriting a war. Elena moved deeper into the forest, her breath cutting through the cold air in thin, trembling streams. Night pressed at her heels, swallowing the last traces of daylight behind the distant ridge. The trees grew denser the farther she went, towering pines stretching skyward like ancient guardians, their branches arching low as though trying to shield her or claim her. She couldn't tell which. She kept the backpack close, gripping the strap until her fingers ached. The weight of the diamonds inside felt heavier than stone, their presence pulling her down with the reminder that danger had a face now, multiple faces, hidden behind the trees closing in around her. She couldn't keep running forever. She needed concealment, distance, time to think. Anything that gave her even a few precious moments before the dark swallowed her completely. Her grandmother's cottage lay behind her, quiet and violated, its secrets no longer safely buried. Ahead, the valley stretched like a maze carved in shadows. The forest floor squished beneath her boots, soft with layers of pine needles dampened by the evening frost. She slowed near a fallen tree, crouching low behind it as she listened. The forest hummed faintly, a soft crackle of branches, a distant flutter of wings, but beneath it, fainter than breath, crept a rhythm she was beginning to recognize, footsteps, measured, directional, tracking her. Her heart lurched painfully. She pressed her hand over her mouth to steady her breathing and leaned forward, peering between the twisted branches. The path behind her remained empty but not silent. The footsteps grew clearer, one man moving with a trained precision, another joining him moments later. Two sets, two shadows blending with the valley's darkness. She slipped backward, deeper behind the fallen trunk, knowing she had minutes, maybe seconds, before they reached this stretch of forest. The sky darkened to an indigo haze. The first stars flickered faintly overhead, small and cold. The temperature fell sharply, biting into her exposed skin. Elena moved again. Her boots whispered across the ground, guided by instinct more than planning. She kept low as she weaved between dense clusters of underbrush, avoiding areas where moonlight dusted the floor in streaks of silver. Every rustle, every crackle, every sigh of wind now carried the threat of discovery. Her grandmother had survived out here, somehow, alone. Elena wondered what kind of strength that required, what kind of fear she had carried by herself year after year, and what sacrifices she made to guard a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. A chill swept through Elena as she crossed a shallow dip in the terrain. The ground here was softer, almost too soft. Her boots sank slightly, and the forest scent deepened. Earth, moss, and something else. Something metallic, familiar, the cold cellar smell. She paused, turning slowly. The trees here were different, older, their trunks thick with time, their bark etched with natural patterns that didn't feel entirely natural. A faint marking caught her eye, a symbol carved into the wood, the same symbol her grandmother had drawn in her diary. The valley was a map, a message, a warning. The forest here held another piece of her grandmother's past. But before she could move toward the tree, a sound cut through the air, sharp, heavy, unmistakable. A twig snapped, close. Elena's breath vanished from her lungs. She dropped instantly, pressing herself against the trunk of a wide pine. Her fingers dug into the forest floor as she listened. The footsteps were no longer distant. They were here, in the same clearing, their patterns slow, patient, predatory. She could hear their breaths naucant, rolled, almost silent. Men who had hunted long enough to understand the language of silence. Her pulse thrashed beneath her ribs as one of the men spoke, his voice low and thick with irritation. "She's close," the other answered, tone quieter, colder. "She's not trained. She'll panic." A pause. She already did. Elena gritted her teeth to stop the trembling in her jaw. They were close enough to see her tracks.